Hey guys, it's Tori, and today I'm going to be doing one of my favorite videos to film, one of my favorite types of videos to watch, and that is my favorite books of the previous year, so 2022. I honestly had a pretty great reading year in 2022. I ended up reading more than I have in the past couple years, not by necessarily a ton, but a decent amount. And today I have 16 books that I want to go over that I consider favorites. I have ranked these, so I'm going to start from my least favorite to my most favorite of the year. And like I said, there's 16 of these, so let's just get right into this so it's not terribly long. Number 16 on my list is Jane Austen at Home by Lucy Worsley. This is a biography of Jane Austen focused around the different homes that she lived in. It was actually my first biography of Jane Austen. I've seen a little bit about her from like documentaries and stuff, but I honestly didn't know very much. I had heard people say that this wasn't a good place to start as far as biographies of Jane Austen went, that there were a couple others that people recommended instead. Having this be my first biography of Jane Austen, I would say I think this does a good enough job. Like, you don't need to stress too much about picking up a different one. I partially physically read this, and then I also listened to it on audiobook. I actually listened to it while I was sick with COVID during the summer, and it was just so cozy and perfect for what I needed at that time. Over the years, I have grown an appreciation for Jane Austen. I don't think she's ever going to be considered a favorite author by me because I don't think any of her books grip me quite that much, but I do love discussing them. I do love revisiting them. They're definitely very cozy. I guess I could say she's probably my favorite cozy feeling author, or one of them. I might put Elizabeth Gaskell a little bit above her, but both of them are in that range. But I love Lucy Worsley's writing style. It was very easy to get into and understand, and I appreciated how well researched this clearly was, and just the respect for Jane Austen as a person. Lucy Worsley, in fact, starts off the book with an introduction in which she discusses how, because we don't know a lot about Jane Austen herself, what she thought about certain things, how she felt about certain things due to many of her letters and stuff being burned. Every historian who studies her ends up kind of creating their version of Jane Austen in a lot of ways, and so Lucy Worsley makes that very clear and then talks about how she's going to go into this and explore her version of Jane Austen based on what she knows. And I just really appreciated that little note, and I think it also improved my personal enjoyment while reading. Number 15 on my list is actually another nonfiction, which is a bit unusual for me to have multiple nonfictions on this list, and this is not the last one. And that book is I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. I know this is on a lot of people's favorites of the year, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. It's her memoir about her experience working in acting on TV and her mother really pushing her to be a part of that life even though she didn't really want to, as well as just some of the other abuses that her mother put her through. I listened to the audiobook for this, which is narrated by herself, and I just really liked getting into her head. I liked that it was in her voice because it made it a little bit more real. It's an enjoyable memoir to read, very easy to get into. There's a lot of humor and a lot of emotion involved, and I just felt like she really did a good job of writing her own story and exploring topics that she's had to deal with throughout her life. And in the end, it was definitely a standout for this year. In spot number 14, I have here Silas Marner by George Eliot. This is a short little Victorian novel following an old man who's very separated from society. People have not treated him well in the past due to accusations that he received of committing a crime, which he did not commit, and we end up following him as he loses something that's really important to him, only to discover something new that becomes even more important to him. With how short it is, I feel like that's the best way to describe it without giving too much away. We do also follow a richer family within the community, and specifically the two sons in this family and their different kind of perspective on life and some of their different struggles and bad choices that they've made. This book honestly was just sweet while also being not too sweet and having a little more depth and emotion involved than just like feeling cozy necessarily. I did really like Silas Marner as a character. I found him really just fun to follow and get to know, and it was just a great read. I find that George Eliot is more and more becoming a favorite author of mine because this is not the only book on this list that you will see by her, so just a hint there, but I did really love this. And yeah, definitely a great read if you have not read it yet. Number 12 on the list, I have here Elektra by Jennifer Saint. And I actually originally would not have thought I would have ended up putting this on this list. It was good And while I read it, I was like, yeah, this is enjoyable, but there were like other Greek myth retellings that I've read in the past that I enjoyed better still, and so I was like, I don't know if this will necessarily be a favorite, but I did enjoy it. But this book has just replayed in my mind ever since I read it. Just the different perspectives we're following. We're following 3 female perspectives within the story of Clytemnestra and Agamemnon and Elektra, which, if you don't know that story, basically it's part of the Iliad. In order to set sail for the Trojan War, Agamemnon, who's leading the army, ends up sacrificing his eldest daughter. Of course, this ends up making Clytemnestra angry, and so when he returns from the Trojan War 10 years later, she has plans for him. Additionally, we follow Elektra, who is the daughter of Clytemnestra and Agamemnon, and she's very young when the Trojan War starts, and so she kind of ends up being more on her father's side, and so we're able to follow her perspective. And then we also follow Cassandra, who is a seer in Troy during the Trojan War, who is cursed to tell people the future and see the future, but no one ever believes her. If you wanted more of an exploration of that myth before going into this, I would recommend The Oresteia by Aeschylus. That is one that is focused on this story. It's a trilogy of plays that he wrote in ancient Greece, and it goes through this story pretty well. But anyway, this, like I said, it's just really stuck with me. Cassandra is my favorite character, even though her perspective maybe is not really as necessary to the story. I just really liked her perspective and liked following her story. Then I would probably put Clytemnestra. I just find her a very interesting figure. And then Elektra at the bottom, who I still found interesting, but she did kind of annoy me at certain points. Clytemnestra did too, but Elektra just on a different level. So anyway, that all being said though, it was not enough to like hinder my enjoyment of the book. I was really surprised, honestly, that I liked this so much because I did read Ariadne by Jennifer Saint last year and did not really like it. I was honestly kind of disappointed in it, like many other people I know were, but I surprisingly really enjoyed this one, and I'm excited to see what she does in the future. Hopefully she'll go on this trend of improving over time and we won't get another dud. But we shall see. Next up, we have Yellow Wife by Sadeqa Johnson. This is a story following a slave girl who ends up becoming kind of an honorary wife to a slave trader, and just all of her really tragic and kind of unique experiences as a slave during the years just before the Civil War. And it's a really, really tragic book. Absolutely very tragic, as you could imagine based on that synopsis. But I really appreciated, first of all, the writing's great. It wasn't necessarily something amazing, but it was very easy to read. It wasn't distracting at all. Our main character, Phoebe Dolores Brown, is very interesting to follow. She's in a very interesting position, being actually the biological daughter of the plantation owner where she grew up. And because of this, she has a bunch of hopes for what could happen for her in the future, but a lot of those are dashed due to various situations. Beyond the main character and some of the side characters that I enjoyed, this book really does stand out in that it's addressing a topic that I have learned a lot about, discussed a lot about, read a lot about, but it does it in a little bit more of a different perspective and focus on a slightly different aspect of it. And so it ended up being really enjoyable because it didn't feel like, I hate to say it this way because it sounds so crass, but I feel like it's the only way I know how to say it, but basically it just didn't feel like another slave book. Like, it felt more unique and a little bit more nuanced in what was going on, and I just, yeah, it really stood out to me. It was a wonderful read and just fascinating to see this aspect of slavery that was going on at the time that you wouldn't normally think about. So anyway, really enjoyed this and would highly recommend it. In the 11th spot, we have the first book that I read this year, actually, or this past year. It's 2023 now. But that book is Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel. This is one that's been very popular for a long time. I know a lot of people were particularly picking it up over the past couple of years because it does deal with a pandemic. But if you don't know about this book basically starts on the eve of the end of the world, pretty much, and we are following a theater group who are putting on King Lear, and the man who plays King Lear is this old, very well-known actor, and he ends up having a heart attack and dies that night. And then pretty much the next day the world ends, so he dies right before all the chaos happens. It's a non-linear story where we are following both people before, specifically the actor, and people surrounding him before the apocalypse apocalypse, basically, before the pandemic hits. Then we follow a little bit of things going on, like when the apocalypse was going on and like when it all started and how it just rapid fire fell apart. And then we follow 10 years after everything's happened, and we follow a troupe of performers who perform Shakespeare. And there's a girl that we specifically follow who ended up meeting this actor towards the end of his life. And so we're just seeing all these different connections, and it's really, well, it is an apocalyptical novel. It's also kind of a slice of life story where you're exploring just the different aspects of humanity and their resilience, but also their love for each other, strength of relationships, strength of individual people. And I just really ended up being moved by it, really enjoyed it. The characters stood out. The situation obviously was wild. And I can just say, even though COVID has been very difficult, I'm glad it was not on this level. So I know a lot of people have not been able to read pandemic books because it just stresses them out. For me, reading something like this during this has been like, oh, thank goodness, it could be so much worse. So anyway, there's a little bit of comfort in that. Getting into the top 10, we have here Elantra by Brandon Sanderson. This is the first published work of Brandon Sanderson's, at least I'm pretty sure it is. Yes, it says right on the back that it's his debut novel, so it was written like over 10 years ago, and it follows 3 different perspectives. It's in a world where there's the city called Elantra, and at one point 10 years before we start this story, it was known to be basically the city of gods. People would just overnight transform into these beings who have these gifts, and they would move to Elantra. They were kind of worshipped. But then one day, out of nowhere, these people, these Elantrians, suddenly become like ill. Like becoming an Elantrian becomes a curse. It's almost like they become walking corpses, but they can't die. And they end up being shoved into Elantra and locked away, and there's a bunch of political maneuvering going on. The 3 perspectives we follow Raodin, who is a man who at the very first chapter, he is transformed into Elantrians during the night, and he ends up being put into Elantra. We follow Serene, who is actually the woman that Raodin was supposed to marry, but as soon as she gets there, she hears that he's passed away very suddenly. But now she's kind of owned by his father due to aspects of the betrothal contract, and so she is doing a lot of political maneuvering in this area. And then we follow Hrathen, who is a very zealous religious man, religious leader, who is trying to convert the people of this kingdom that they're in to the religion of his nation, who is threatening to destroy this nation if they don't. So there's a lot of pieces going on. They all do end up connecting, but I just felt like the world is fascinating. I find Brandon Sanderson's worlds and stories to just be very engaging, very fast to read through. I do like his characterization. I know some people don't love kind of his characterization or his descriptions and writing. I don't mind it. There maybe are some points where his writing style pulls me out a little bit based on how he describes certain things, but overall I just find myself so engaged in it. I really liked Raodin in particular as a character, though I did like Serene as well. I also will say I find that I really like Brandon Sanderson's romances in his books, which I feel like that's not what very many people say, but I just like that he creates romances where the romance and the friendship grow at the same time, and that's my favorite, where it's a slow burn, but it's kind of like, rather than like friends to lovers, it's more like you are becoming friends and romantically attracted to each other at the same time, and I just really love that, and he does that very well in his books. So anyway, all that to say, loved this, and it motivated me to want to read the rest of the Cosmere / reread the parts I've already read. Up next, I felt like I had to include at least one of these books, so I chose, of course, my favorite of the trilogy, and that is Bring Up the Bodies by Hilary Mantel, the second book in the Wolf Hall trilogy. I ended up co-hosting a group read for this. Unfortunately, we planned live shows and stuff, and that just kind of petered out. We really just did the first one, but it was still fun to read and discuss. This series is following the perspective of Thomas Cromwell, who is a very important person during the reign of Henry VIII. He was involved heavily, specifically in getting Anne Boleyn on the throne, but also getting her off, and then also bringing in Anne of Cleves later. He, for a time was Henry VIII's most trusted advisor in a lot of ways, but he really began in very humble circumstances, which makes, of course, a lot of people at court angry that he's so well trusted. The writing style is very dense in a lot of ways, and I feel like if you don't know very much about the Tudors, you may want to learn a little bit more before going into this. Not that you need to know everything, but particularly things surrounding Thomas Cromwell himself. I think it's very helpful. It's helpful to separate out characters, historical figures in the story. But yes, of the three, I did find that I enjoyed Bring Up the Bodies the most. It is the shortest, which kind of helped. It made the plot a lot faster to get through. It also is dealing with probably the most dramatic part of this whole story, which is the undoing of Anne Boleyn and her beheading, and that's really what most of this book is focused on. And so you can imagine this would be very pacey and exciting compared to the other two, and I really liked it. I didn't necessarily love the portrayal of Anne as a figure. I didn't hate it though, I just felt like I would have done it a little bit differently. But overall, it's a great series. I understand why so many people love it. At number 8, we have Vanity Fair by William Thackeray, another group read that I hosted. This one I did by myself. I did this one and then we read Gone with the Wind because they have very similar aspects to their plots. And of the two, I did end up enjoying Vanity Fair a little bit more. I think I just enjoyed the characters a bit more. I enjoyed it being this kind of plot being told in a more satirical way, whereas Gone with the Wind is a little bit more serious. I understand why a lot of people struggle with this, but I don't know. I ended up being more engaged with the characters than I think a lot of other people are. They are very stereotyped. I guess I should describe this one. Basically, this primarily follows two perspectives of two different women. One is Amelia, who is a very sweet, good person who ends up suffering a lot of hardship, and then we also follow Becky Sharp, who is very manipulative, cunning, and she kind of ends up on top in a lot of ways. Like, she ends up being as happy as a person like her would be. So anyway, like I said, they're very stereotyped and kind of cartoonish in the way that they are very extreme in like who they are. They can be seen as very one-dimensional because like Becky Sharp is just manipulative and cunning and kind of awful, and then Amelia is the complete opposite and is just very innocent. But I think what I love about this book is there are moments where you add a little bit more depth to them. There are moments where Amelia maybe is kind of selfish and not very observant of other people and their needs. There are moments when Becky Sharp shows some level of appreciation and care for some of the people around her, particularly for Amelia. And so while they are very caricatured, they are also surprisingly nuanced at different points. Like overall they're caricatured, but in certain moments you see a little bit of nuance, and I just liked experiencing that. I should also mention this is set during the Napoleonic Wars, and the Battle of Waterloo happens about halfway through, and that adds an interesting dimension just to the setting that they're living in. But ultimately I really loved this one. I feel like it's one of my favorite classics now. I honestly should do another favorite classics of all time list because I feel like I definitely have some updates to make to that, but that's besides the point. This one was great, would recommend, although there are several people who have struggled with it, who have DNF'd it or found that it was just okay, so know that going in, it's not for everyone, but it worked very well for me. Up next I have kind of a completely different read, and that is My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. Many of you have probably heard about this, it just came out a couple of years ago, but it is a story following a woman who was abused by her teacher when she was 15, and it's years later. To her, she doesn't feel like she was abused. She feels like this was a real relationship. They're not really together anymore, but they still talk. However, accusations begin coming out about this man from other girls who had gone to this school, and they are reaching out to her to be a witness of what they are expressing. And then we're going back in time to the abusive situation itself. It is very harrowing. It is very hard to read. This is not a book I would recommend to anyone. Maybe to everyone is a better way of saying it, because there are certain people that I think would really enjoy this, but it is very heavy. Kate Elizabeth Russell does an incredible job of bringing this sort of situation to life in a way where you understand why these girls fall into the trap, and it's really hard to read and see her experiences and see her coming to realize how awful her experiences really were. and it was just so well done, very gripping, but I did have to read it very fast because I knew I could not sit in this book for more than a couple of days without falling into a major, like, mental health crash. So it's definitely very harrowing. If you know yourself and you know you can't handle this very well, don't read this. Just don't. It's not worth it. But if you feel like it's a topic you're interested in and that you're able to handle pretty well, this is an incredible book about that topic. Number 6 is Middlemarch by George Eliot. Like I said, another George Eliot on this list. This book is centered around a small community slash village slash town called Middlemarch, and we follow several people within this town, and they're just different life struggles, different things going on. I would say a lot of this book is actually centered around the theme of marriage. What makes a good marriage? What makes a bad marriage? What you need to think about when going into marriage, not rushing into things like that, which is a theme that I really love, especially in Victorian literature. So that just automatically was a win for me. But also the characters in this are wonderful. There's a lot going on. I will say, with George Eliot, this is not my favorite of the ones I've read. I would say Adam Bede is my favorite of the ones I've read. But to be fair with that, I am more of a tragedy, true crime kind of girl, and there's a little bit more of that vibe in Adam Bede, whereas this is a little bit more domestic, which is totally fine. It's just more of a taste thing. But yes, this is a delight to read. George Eliot's writing is wonderful. There are some moments with her where she gets a little too philosophical for me, to where I'm kind of lose interest a little bit, but on the whole, it's great to read. Really loved it. Very excited to read it in the future and get even more out of it. Now we are getting down to the top 5, and in my 5th place, I have Half Sick of Shadows by Laura Sebastian. This is a King Arthur retelling following the perspective of the Lady of Shalott, and it is beautifully done. It's non-linear. We're jumping forward, backward in time. Past, present, and future are all hit within this book between different chapters. However, I will say, if you're worried listening to that, it is pretty easy to follow. It's not a huge deal. But this was just everything I've wanted from a King Arthur retelling for so long. Just the focus on the relationship connections. I feel like I would have liked even more from this, hence why I'm writing my own. But I feel like this is still, it had the tone I really have wanted. It had the focus and characterization that I've really wanted. And so it was just beautiful. It was just wonderful. I will say, if you're looking for an action-packed King Arthur retelling, this is not it. This is very much focused on her personal psychology, kind of the beginnings of the story more than anything, as well as a little bit of the end. But all the like battles and Arthur's growth as a king and all of that jazz is not explored really in this. It's more about the beginnings of everything, as well as just hints at what's going to come. But ultimately, like I said, it had the tone and the characterization that I've really wanted from a King Arthur retelling. It was honestly just a delight. I really, really loved it. Up next, number 4, I have here one of the last books I read in the year, and that is A Little Life by Hanya Yanagihara. I recently did a vlog in which I included this, so I won't talk too much about it because it was so recent. But for those who maybe watch this in the future and didn't see that vlog, this book follows a group of 4 college students, well, friends from college. They've graduated at the beginning of this book, and we follow them throughout their life pretty much. Every part is about 5 or so years forward and more forward in the future. And the story primarily focuses on Jude, who has had a very traumatic past that we don't really know about until the further we get into the book, basically. And then we also follow Willem, who is kind of his best friend, becomes Jude's best friend because they just really understand each other and connect. And we're just following them and their experiences, and it's really, really sad. There's a lot of trigger warnings in this. Definitely don't go into this if you are triggered by almost anything. Anything to do with abuse, anything to do with self-harm and mental health problems, but specifically depression and anxiety, as well as like eating disorders, anything like that, that is included here. And like I said, any kind of abuse at all just is part of this story. So definitely keep that in mind. Kidnapping, there's just all sorts of things going on in this book. Human trafficking. Anyway, yes, a lot of sad things. So definitely, if you're not into that, probably don't read this book. but this definitely surprised me. I was surprised by how much I loved it, primarily because I loved the characters. They were so sweet and so great to follow. I did cry a lot in this book, but not only sad tears, there were some moments that inspired happy tears in me because I just loved these characters so much. And ultimately, it is now my number 4 favorite book of 2022. I just absolutely adored it. Up next, we have Bleak House by Charles Dickens. I read this for Victober this year, and it was just such a comfort read for me. I read it throughout the month. I broke it up, and every time during the day that I was like, oh, I gotta read Bleak House, like, it was such a delight. It was so cozy. It was so nice to cozy up with these characters. This book has a lot of plot lines and threads, but kind of the general overshadowing aspect of it is there is this court case that's been going on for years having to do with a will called Jarndyce and Jarndyce, and we follow several people who are involved in this family and involved in the outcome, the possible outcomes of this court case. The format of this book is very interesting because some chapters are told in third person where we're just following kind of different people around London and stuff, but then other chapters are told in first person from the perspective of Esther Summerson, who I would say is our main character, who is just a delight. She was definitely the best part about this book. I loved her. I loved her storyline, everything going on there. She had a romance that just made me want to die. It was so great, and it was so good. So good. I have discovered Charles Dickens this year. I had read a couple books by him in the past and just nothing had really stood out to me, but this and, spoiler alert, my second favorite of the year really showed me that I was wrong about him, and there are books by him that I can really love. So like I said, number 2 is another Dickens novel, and it is David Copperfield. I loved this book so much. I think about the characters in it all the time. Like, I consistently am just like, oh, I love them. I love David. I love Betsy Trotwood and Mr. Dick and just all of these wonderful characters. And I find Uriah Heep just so creepy and gross, and it's just a delight to just hate him. I love the family that lives in a shipwrecked upside down ship. Like, it's so great, and it's a magical, wonderful book. I did listen to the audiobook mostly for this. I read a little bit physically, but mostly it was the audiobook by Richard Armitage, and I would say he had a great voice because it's first person, so he had a great voice for being David Copperfield telling his story, and so I really loved that. But yeah, ultimately, absolutely adored this. Now one of my favorite books of all time. It's just so wonderful, so wonderful. And my number 1 book is surprisingly a nonfiction, which is so out of the ordinary for me, but I just loved this book so much. I listened to the audiobook. It was a full cast. It was just a delight. It made me cry a lot on my way to and from work because of the topic, and that is The Only Plane in the Sky by Garrett Graff. I think. I did not double check his name, and my physical copy that I did get after listening to the audiobook is currently in the hands of my brother at college because I recommended it to him, so don't have it. Here's the picture. This is subtitled An Oral History of 9/11, and so basically the author conducted and watched a bunch of interviews with various people who experienced that day. The story is told chronologically. I believe it starts with the day before and then it gets to the morning of, and then just all the different events. It kind of just spirals through the rest of the events of that day. And basically what he did was he wrote down the actual words of these people and then kind of combined it into a cohesive story. So each person gets maybe 1 or 2 sentences at a time as they're telling their story, and then it will switch to a different person, a different perspective from that day, but within the same context and their thoughts, and it kind of just leads to all these different stories, all these different experiences and feelings that were going on during that day. The audiobook was incredible. It was a full cast. It also included at least a couple of actual audio recordings from like air traffic control, as well as a couple of speeches, I think, given by some of the presidents, so like George W. Bush and Obama when Osama bin Laden was killed towards the end. And so that was just a really nice addition to the audiobook. I haven't completely looked through the physical copy, but I'm assuming they're just transcripted. But it's very emotional, as you can imagine, and it was really my first experience deep diving into 9/11, and it was just such an incredible book to listen to. I loved it. I would love to revisit it at some point, definitely when I am in the right headspace for it, but it was incredible. Highly recommend if you have not read it or heard of it. It's amazing, and it is my favorite of 2022. So that is it. This video is stupid long. I was really hoping I could rush through it, but I need to go because I got 4.5 hours of sleep last night because I stayed up late with a friend, and then I had to get up early for a work meeting, and then I knew after the meeting I would be able to nap, but then I had planned to film this video and my worst books of the year video today, and I knew if I didn't just do it, then I would not be able to get a very restful nap because I wouldn't be able to stop thinking about it. So this is done. I'm taking a nap. Let me know your favorite book of 2022. Try to pick only one if you can. I know it's really hard. You can do up to 3. I'll allow up to 3, but try to do only one because it's a nice, fun challenge. Also, let me know if you've read any of the books I've mentioned, your thoughts on them, if you liked them as much as I did. If you really didn't, I would love to know. I hope 2022 went well for you in your reading, and if not, I hope 2023 is much better. And really, even if 2022 was a great year, I hope 2023 continues to improve. Thank you again so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!